This is the lecture on chapter 3, also for week 2 of the Fredriksen book for RLST 006 Jesus. This chapter is called Trajectories, Paul, the Gospels, and Jesus. And again, these lectures cannot really replace the book, but they're just meant to supplement, give you some ideas. So a very long chapter, so I'll get right into it. We begin by thinking about interpretations of Jesus, various possible interpretations. For instance, we could think of a kind of Jesus that does explain the data point we have of the church that's going to grow out of Jesus's life, right? The followers of Jesus. It would explain the church, but it wouldn't explain his end. And this is the idea of Jesus as a teacher of universal love, right? That he taught people to love one another. He created, so then the church picks that up. But it doesn't really explain why the Romans would kill someone. If he's teaching Jews to love Gentiles, they would not have a problem with that at all, right? Jews cause revolutions. That's why Jews get crucified, not for teaching love. That wouldn't cause any resentment at all from the Romans. Another interpretation would explain the priest's hostility, but then not Pilate or the Romans' role, right? So Jesus, what if he's opposed to Jewish hierarchies? He's fighting back against Jewish traditions. He's kind of an anti-priest figure. And we've seen some of this in like the Qumran community, seen tensions between Pharisees and Sadducees. Maybe he's this. He's fighting against the Jewish temple cult. That would explain why the priests don't like him and maybe want to kill him, but it would also not explain why the Roman government would get involved, right? Again, he's crucified. If the Jews were going to kill him, he would be stoned. And Romans were very tolerant in terms of religion in general. They were accepting of many gods and many traditions, and they were respectful of Jewish traditions as well. And there's no reason for them to get involved in an intra-Jewish dispute. They never really cared about the Essenes criticizing the priests or any of this. So it doesn't really make sense here either to that Jesus would be crucified. A kind of third interpretation of Jesus that's also been popular uses the Q material, the Quella material that's supposedly an imagined source for Matthew and Luke. Here, these kind of sayings in Q are usually kind of witty and culturally subversive. So then, in this case, again, we don't, Romans don't have any problem with witty sayings. It would be some sort of misunderstanding. Somehow Jesus is talking about topsy-turvy things like the head being the tail, the greater serving the lesser, and then people got upset and said, well, Rome, said, this is Jesus dying by misunderstanding. Rome took it seriously, that somehow this is a revolutionary figure and not just witty, not just culturally subversive, and decided to crucify him. When we're thinking about history, we have to recognize we're not talking about autobiography or personal retrospection, right? So we can reflect on our own lives, we can write things. These things are private and individual and untestable when we're talking about our internal states, our emotional states, our history. History is social and public, right? It's based on data, based on written records. You can test its plausibility. You can debate about it, and you can think about parameters in which something might be realistic or not, right? So we can think about history being useful in the case of Jesus because there is public record to some extent, right? Which is that these facts and these data, the points that we've talked about, the movement and the writings that came out of this movement, that is history, that is historical data. Some of the Roman sources are historical data, and then of course crucifixion, as we've talked about, is a historical data. And when we're examining the Gospels, we have to recognize how they cut forward and backward in time. They kind of surround this life of Jesus and the time of their own writing. They're trying to go back to talk about the life of a figure, possibly 50 years, 60 years after his death. And they're trying to capture these original stories, but they're also cutting forward because they come from a future time. They're being set down. Even the earliest of these Gospels probably don't find their final form until after the temple is destroyed, 70 CE, so at least 40 years after Jesus' death. So they know the future in a way. They know events to come. Um, and then Paul, the letters of Paul interact with this timeline in a very interesting way because Paul's letters are actually earlier. He's writing before the temple is destroyed. All of his writings are happening. He dies before the temple is destroyed. And so it's the earliest figure we have. And he's also talking about Jesus's life. So it would seem to be an ideal figure to understand the historical Jesus. Except the problem is that Paul's interest in Jesus is mainly theological, not really historical. He's mainly talking about the Christ uh, and not Jesus, if you will, the Christ, the Messiah, who has died for the sins of the world to defeat the enemies, the demonic forces of evil, to bring in the kingdom of God, and risen from the dead to bring life and the possibility of eternal life to all people. That is not the Jesus of history. That is not the one who's walking around in Galilee and who we can examine, whose speakings or sayings and actions might have caused his crucifixion. So this is this is the problem with Paul. Still, we should understand Paul because he is so early, because he's the earliest figure we have that is talking about Jesus. And when we're thinking about Paul, um, Christ is the center of Paul's gospel, but it's not just Christ. Like we've pointed out, it's not Jesus the human figure so much as Jesus the coming King. Um, Paul is looking forward as much as Jesus has already accomplished with the death and resurrection, with the crucifixion and resurrection. Paul is really looking forward in time to an end of all history, an end of all time, and that is the end times. The so-called eschatology is the official name. He's focused on this version of Christ who will come again to fully bring in the kingdom of God. And what's the timeline? Well, Paul has this pretty long and well spelled out timeline. There's a shout, a trumpet, the resurrection of all the dead, and the followers of Christ will participate, both the living and the dead. The dead will be raised, they will be transformed into some sort of spiritual, glorious bodies. They will participate in the final triumph over evil. Jesus is the key figure in all of this. He's coming as the Messiah, as a warrior and a king to bring in the kingdom. He wins the cosmic battle, and this is this is basically the timeline, and in Paul's mind, this is coming anytime. It's very soon. This is he's expecting it in his lifetime, and um, there's a real urgency to his message. The wrath of God is coming, and the judgment of God is coming, as well as this potential glorious reward for those who will obey his message. And but it's not predictable. Paul is not setting a date. It's kind of unknown. He says like the day is near, but it also comes like a thief in the night. Breaking into one's house, totally unexpected, right? No one knows that the thief is coming. The whole point is that the thief chooses a time when no one knows. And so that is Paul's point. It's coming very, very soon. We don't know when. I cannot give you an exact day or time. Mark, one of the writers of one of the Gospels, has an understanding of the kingdom that's similar to Paul's in some ways. It's near. Um, but there are some differences too. For both Mark and Paul, it's coming soon. But for Mark, using Jesus' words, he's talking about a specific set of events that has to happen before Jesus can come. The temple has to be destroyed, for instance, and whereas with Paul, again, there's no hint that the temple or anything has to happen there. They're both looking for this cosmic heavenly kingdom to replace the earthly kingdom, but for Mark has specific ideas that the earthly temple must be gone, and this may be related to some extent to Mark's use of Daniel. The book of Daniel is written in captivity in Babylon to the Jews, and it contains a lot of visions and apocalyptic scenes. And it it may be related, Daniel may be related to the actual historical events like the Seleucids. The Seleucids are one of the successor states that follows Alexander. It's one of Alexander's generals, begins his own dynasty, his own empire. And this general builds an altar to Olympian Zeus in the temple of the Jews, right? Which is a total blasphemy against everything the Jews believe about the purity of the worship of just the one God of Israel. And so this abomination of desolation, Daniel is talking about using these kind of uh, terrifying terms of great evil, get picked up by Mark. So it could be that this desolation of the temple, this destruction of the temple that's talked about in Daniel with regard to Antiochus and Epiphanes is picked up in Mark, also knowing about the destruction of the temple in 70 CE when the Roman general Titus comes and destroys the temple. So the temple is a central point of discussion in Mark's apocalyptic timeline. And again, this is something that sets Mark apart from Paul. Then, if we go on to Matthew and Luke, you'll see that they kind of reframe the apocalypse also. They either don't emphasize it or they change the details. For Mark, the date was near, it's at the door, like Paul. Now, for Matthew, it's in the future. The days will be shortened is one of the phrases Matthew uses. And then for Luke, the timeline is almost completely gone. Luke's point is that the kingdom is already here. The kingdom is already among you. So we're no longer looking for an apocalyptic change, but just thinking about an existence, a different order that is already here. And then when we think about other New Testament writings, right, no longer in the Gospels, but later Christian writings, I mean, you have people like Peter, the second letter of Peter, and which is probably one of the latest books written in the New Testament. There's phrases there that say 1 day with God is like 1,000 years. So this is a very different idea of soon now, right? It's no longer the kingdom is coming soon, but the whole timeline has been stretched way out so that, well, if God wants to wait a week, it'll be 7,000 years, right? So that's not so soon anymore. Um, Paul specifically also talks about the brethren, the apostles, and the 12 as people who have seen, who are important in the Christian message and who have seen Jesus risen from the dead, these kind of people. The brethren may refer to this group of 500 who received Jesus. Apostle, this phrase means a sent one, a messenger. And the 12 are 12 apostles specifically commissioned and sent out on these missions in the different gospel narratives. And then Paul also checks this, kind of name checks this. So Paul has an understanding that there are 12 special apostles, just like the gospels do. And the gospels are kind of interesting. They have different names for them. John doesn't even bother to name them at all. He just mentions that there are 12. The other gospels all do give their names. And what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to go preach the gospel. They're supposed to go share the message, the good news. Gospel means good news. Talk about the empty tomb, that Jesus has risen. It's a little bit different in the different gospels. Are they supposed to speak only to the Jews or to all the world, to all creation? Matthew and Luke have two different ideas about that. In terms of this mission, when we think about it with respect to other ancient religions and schools of thought, what stands out is, there are other philosophical schools that also send their students out to speak this message. But Jews generally are not involved in this at all. Jews are not interested in spreading their message or winning converts. But these followers, these Jews, these followers of Jesus, who are also Jews and see themselves at this time, in the early period, as Jews, as a branch of Judaism, they did. They're going beyond the Jews even and speaking to Gentiles all around the Mediterranean world. And there's also a strange way in which Jerusalem is its headquarters, but they keep moving out. So they're trying to maintain both. They're trying to spread the message widely to all peoples, but they're also maintaining a foothold in Jerusalem. And then finally, the way we could tie all these messages together is actually, again, apocalypticism, because there are Old Testament prophecies, there are Hebrew Bible prophecies that Jerusalem will be the center from which the Messiah reigns, and that all people, all Gentiles will one day believe in the God of Israel. So, the fact of both Jerusalem and these missions and the inclusion of the Gentiles, whereas the Gentiles, as we've seen for most Jews, cannot be included. They have to be circumcised. They have to pass the pretty high bar of keeping kosher, circumcision, etc. For these new Christian community, they're trying hard to welcome Gentiles rather than pushing them away, right? As it almost seems other Jews would be doing. All these things would fit into the apocalyptic scheme. That we have a center of the movement in Jerusalem, waiting for the Messiah. For them, for these Jesus followers, it is Jesus to return and come back and rule in Jerusalem. We're spreading the message to all the Gentiles as a sign that the end is there. There are other signs that emphasize this kind of apocalyptic nature of Jesus' message. And we can see it for both in the Gospels and in Paul. Both Paul and Jesus teach a very high level of sexual self-discipline. Paul thinks that even within marriage, sometimes people should be abstinent, right? Both of them are very hesitant about divorce. I mean, the Gospels say that there's no divorce at all. If they divorce, they should either stay single, in other words, not remarry, or just reconcile, come back together. The Jewish sexual ethic is already much less permissive than the Greco-Roman one, right? This is kind of a famous difference between the Greco-Roman culture and Jews. They have very, very different ideas of pederasty, of homosexuality, even of rape and things like that, versus the Jews. The Jews are much more interested in sexual self-discipline, whereas the Greco-Roman idea of sex is much more basically forgiving or even admiring of power and the powerful taking what's theirs by force. and not overindulging perhaps, but displaying their might. Where Jesus and Paul are taking what's already a very restrictive Jewish sexual ethic, right? That men should only be married to women, that they should stay in a monogamous, committed relationship, and they're pushing it even further, even in the direction of, as Paul and Jesus both seem to talk about, celibacy or becoming a eunuch for the kingdom. We know that there are people who practice self-castration. Eunuchs are men who have had their genitals removed, so that they can serve in a kingly court and in harems and things like that, without fear of their sexual immorality with the women of the court. So when Jesus is teaching about sexual ethics, and Paul both, they sometimes say it's probably better not to marry. So they take what's already a restrictive Jewish ethic and push it even further towards like this kind of almost impossibly high level of perfectionism, right? Total celibacy, no sex at all for life. If it was hard enough to be married and to not divorce, we're going to push it even more. So why? Again, what is the relationship? What is the reason for this? And here we have a very fascinating clue with the Essenes or the Qumran community. They also have a perfectionistic ethic. They're also interested in very strict sexual ethics and practicing celibacy. And this, for them, it ties in with other forms of perfectionistic ethics for the Qumran community and possibly for the New Jesus community. The Acts talks about something that Qumran was doing, which is holding everything in common. So financially absolutist, financially perfectionistic to go along with this kind of sexual perfectionism. So total restraint in terms of sex, total restraint in terms of money, right? And the point for all these groups, the point for Qumran is because the end is near. That is why you would exercise and push and teach such a high level of morality, because it's a little bit like if the final test is coming, you're going to cram, you're going to study hard. This is the test of all tests, right? God is coming soon, the Messiah is coming, all the children of darkness are going to be destroyed, absolutely destroyed, and the children of light, are going to be victorious. You want to be totally sure that you're on the side of the children of light, right? It is worth paying the price of being exceptionally moral if you know that it's only for a week anyway before the end comes, and there are going to be huge consequences to all moral behavior when that comes. So, but at the same time, we shouldn't assume that the Christians are basing their ideas off the Essenes. The Essenes are kind of hidden away in this desert community at Qumran. That's where the name comes from. They're not really spreading their ideas in their writings. They're really writing for themselves. But again, there are these fascinating similarities and differences in this apocalyptic focus. Even if they're not a break-off group, and even if the Christians are much more missionary and the Essenes are much more secluded, still we see this emphasis on a Messiah, on an end times, on an apocalypse to come, and preparing for it in radical ways sometimes. And so another aspect of this possible apocalypse is we see Jesus getting hostile with the temple. All the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all have a moment where Jesus is, even though the timeline might be different, they all have a moment where Jesus is in the temple, turning everything over, condemning it, condemning the commerce, the buying and selling, famously saying, "You've turned my father's house into a den of thieves." And this becomes the core of an accusation against Jesus, that he's against the law and the temple. And we will see, what are the possible interpretations. But again, it could hint at something apocalyptic, that Jesus is saying, this is what's going to happen. I'm not so much personally trying to destroy the temple. Of course, it's a huge building, and throwing over a couple tables doesn't do anything. But he could be enacting what he sees is going to happen, right? Prophetically looking into the future, that this temple will be destroyed, which again, we know it will be actually 40 years after the death of Jesus, some 10 years maybe after the death of Paul, when Titus comes. So let's see. When we think about similarities and differences with Paul and Jesus, we can say that both of them are intensifying the Torah. They're saying, like we saw already with marriage, that they're cranking up the demands of the Torah, but also suggesting that there's some sort of freedoms from certain restrictions, like especially the Sabbath, for instance, for Jesus, and for Paul, circumcision and diet. And then both Jesus and his Jewish opponents are all assuming that the Torah is important. So it's important not to lose sight, even though they have some disagreements. They're arguing about certain traditions about food and days, Sabbath, as I've already mentioned. They do all assume that the Torah is important, and to some extent that the temple is, even though Jesus might be pointing out that the temple's days are numbered. Um, there is also the fact of Jesus' miracles. This is another vector of analysis for Jesus' life. We should know that miracles are somewhat commonplace in a certain sense. They're expected. There are, during the time of Jesus, there's an expectation that someone who comes from God can do some sort of sign or wonders, which is the biblical term for this. It's a sign of something, a sign of a divine power, a sign of supernatural power, and it's a wonder because it's something unexpected, something more than the average person can do. But by themselves, the miracles don't prove anything. There is this argument, even preserved within the New Testament, that people are saying, well, what if it's a demon doing this? What if it's an evil power, right? Um, the miracles can enhance what Jesus says in a way. They can say this person maybe has divine authority, but that's up to interpretation. Um, Another thing that the miracles are probably saying in Jesus's case is that this is what the kingdom of God will be like. We're looking forward to a time when there will be no more demons, no more sickness. All the weaknesses of human life now, death, hunger, frailty, are going to be solved. There will be an abundance of bread, and paralytics can walk again, and the deaf can hear again, and the blind can see again. And all these problems, they are not just an authorization of Jesus personally, but also an invitation or a little preview of coming attractions of the kingdom that's yet to come. Even these, we can see this kind of kingdom atmosphere or understanding even into the Last Supper, right? This communal meal that Jesus has in the tradition or in these Gospels right before his death. These symbols, the bread and the wine, the body and the blood, it could be pointing to this sacrifice, right? That is a common understanding or a keystone of Jewish religion, and also suggesting something about the kingdom. Once again, a future time when all of them will sit together in a community and enjoy a feast again. Um, Even Jesus's own name that he's commonly known by, Christ, right? Christ, we've already talked about, is a Greek version of Moshiach or Messiah, which means the smeared one, the anointed one. What is the expectation when Jews hear about a Messiah? When they're hearing about a Moshiach, what do they mean? They really are thinking about a king. They are thinking about David, the paradigmatic king of Israel. He is the ultimate anointed one. He's the one chosen by God. He's the founder of the temple and of the most glorious of these kind of united kings of Israel, the one who's closest to God's heart, at least. And so and he's a leader. He's a victorious leader, leader of in war and battles, conqueror over all the enemies of Israel. So he's when Jews are thinking about when they're hearing this announcement that Jesus is the Messiah, is the Christ, their understanding would be he would be a king, a victorious king. And built into these stories are that even exile, even the suffering of Israel, is meant to be understood as part of this messianic expectation. The Jews are going to suffer; they will go through difficulties, but it's okay because the Messiah will come and make all these things right. So their current understanding, their current life under the heel of Roman authority is something that's made not so much a problem as an invitation. It adds fuel to the fire of messianic expectation. Yes, things are terrible. That's just the setup so that God can deliver us. And it's kind of happened before, right? We have the Hasmoneans who are in charge now, Herod and his children, who are ruling with Rome's permission different parts of the land again, today, what is today, Palestine. And so there's this kind of um, cultural civil war, rebellion, successful rebellion that comes from one of the priestly families that overthrows the Seleucids that we've already met, that Greek dynasty, and they have some level of legitimacy. They establish a somewhat independent Jewish state, and that is the state of affairs right when the time that Jesus is born, but there is some question too, because the Messiah is supposed to be a descendant of David, and because the Hasmoneans and the Maccabees aren't even from the high priests, they're not from the right line of the high priest, they're not from the Zadokites, the ones who supported Solomon, the rightful heir of David. There's a lot of questions about their legitimacy. And especially as they keep losing power to Rome over the course of Jesus' life, Romans are getting more and more involved, and the Hasmoneans and others are losing more and more of their independence, that kind of Jewish character or Jewish independent nature of their rule, right? That's why we have a governor like Pilate, who under whom Jesus is crucified. There is, more brewing, more trouble brewing, more resentment brewing in terms of the Jews. Um, so in this case, really we could do a little messianic comparison, right? Both Jews and this new Jesus group that will become Christians, right? They're both saying there should be a Messiah, and they're waiting for the Messiah as a deliverer. They're saying he should come from the house of David. The Christian claim is that Jesus is the son of David. Jews, no, this is not, right? The Jews are expecting a glorious king who will defeat, bring independent kingdom of Israel where everyone is worshiping the Jewish God, right? The Christians say the Messiah died and rose already and will come back in a more apocalyptic sense. They're both looking for a son of God, but in a different way, right? For Jews, the son of God means someone close to God, a Messiah who will represent God. Christians, think about the Trinity in a much more literal sense, that Jesus is somehow eternally begotten of the Father and this kind of thing eventually, or at this point at least, much more than just a close relationship. Something like Christ eventually Jesus stands in for God, God's self in the Christian imagination. So, all these terrible events in Israel, right? Just like with the exile of the Jewish people in history to the Assyrian and Babylonian empires, all are adding on this sense that something has to happen, that the Messiah has to come. And for Paul, his belief that his seeing, his preaching among the Gentiles, and seeing these Greeks and these non-Jews begin to worship the God of Israel because of Jesus, is a huge sign that Jesus is the Messiah, and that the end times are certainly here. Because of kosher rules about what foods are clean to eat, Jews really could not eat with non-Jews. So if you were to convert to Judaism, unless somehow you got all your friends and family to convert with you and all the men to be circumcised, you could no longer have meals anymore with your own family or with your own friends. So there's a huge barrier, like I suggested. They really have to become culturally Jewish. They have to forsake the dominant Greco-Roman culture and become culturally Jewish as well, in a very practical way, including their relationships. Paul is thinking about this in a different way. For Paul, all they have to do is renounce their past religion, follow the Jewish God, right? You can no longer worship any other gods, but there's no rules about circumcision, and there's no rules about eating. You can eat with whoever, and there's not that cultural expectation. You can remain culturally Greco-Roman, but just in terms of who you owe your allegiance to. This is where belief starts to take a higher role, right? Who you owe your allegiance to is only the God of Israel. You're no longer supposed to sacrifice at the pagan gods' temples and such. And you know, a lot of Jews would have opposed Paul's message on the grounds that how can you say Jesus is the Messiah when Messiah is king and king is conqueror and Rome is still obviously ascendant, right? In fact, if you're reading the tea leaves, right, our temple is about to be destroyed. Rome has so much power and Jews have no chance of defeating them. What kind of Messiah was Jesus? He didn't conquer anyone. Paul's kind of solves this by pointing to the second coming. There's a delay, but in the second coming, all the rest of the messianic prophecies will be fulfilled. Some were already fulfilled in Jesus' first coming, such as the victory over death for Jesus himself, and also the Gentiles coming into the covenant with Israel. But other things have to wait for the second coming. We can think a little bit too about this messianic question in the Gospels, right? So we've seen it from the perspective of Paul. In Mark, Christ is quite secretive. He's not openly saying that he is the Christ. Jesus is not saying that he's the Christ. He's keeping things mysterious. Matthew and Luke want to affirm that Jesus is the son of David, and so he is a legitimate source of a potential, messianic candidate, right? Because the Jews and Christians all agree that the Messiah is supposed to come from the lineage of David. Um, but this, for Matthew, Jesus just simply states, at least, that he is the Messiah. And both of them, both Matthew and Luke, are thinking about Jesus not only as the son of David, but even a prophet. And for Luke, this ties back to Jerusalem. This is Luke's presentation of Jesus is very much focused on the temple in Jerusalem because Jerusalem is the center of the Hebrew Bible. It is where the prophets go to preach. It is where salvation and hope and all proper worship are to be done. And it is the place from which God will rule again. So both Matthew and Luke, again, tie together this idea of Jesus as the Messiah. Matthew, much more with the scriptures and Jesus fulfilling the Hebrew Bible. Luke, much more with the city of Jerusalem. So we have, in a way, then, very nice kind of agreement in all of these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and Paul, about at least one aspect of Jesus's life, which is that he sees himself, or that he is seen as the Messiah of a kingdom, ushering in a new age, an apocalypse. Finally, we must understand crucifixion, right? Crucifixion is used by the Romans, and it has already been used on Jews before. Jesus is not the first Jewish target. It is used when there are rebellions, when there are uprisings, when there are revolts. The Romans will crucify these revolutionaries, and they've done it again to Jews several times. For example, in a festival in Samaria, several Jews are crucified because of an uprising. So they're not sparing about it. If there's a danger to their rule, they will crucify and crucify generously, so to speak. A number of followers, their families, sometimes anybody who might be involved in this potential display of revolution to keep the lid on and to keep the empire, the Romans, where they belong at the head of the empire. So these are the trajectories we can see that flesh out a little bit more of the life of Jesus using the historical facts we have, given our understanding of the Jewish times, of Roman politics, and of the documents that we have, both in the Gospels and Paul's writings.